Thank you so much. It's such a thrill to be here. This is the second time I have moderated a Yidan Prize conference. The first was at Stanford University, and it's great to be here. I'm just back from Brazil, where I also moderated a UNESCO conference that was on education leadership. And it's so interesting to come and hear from educators all over the world. Our work at the Hechinger Report, we're a nonprofit news outlet, and we're based in New York City, and we cover our stories take us all over the United States, but it's wonderful to hear from so many of you from around the world about how many common issues that you face, from leadership to resilience. And that last panel was fantastic, very hard one to follow. But you are all focused on educators and education in a different way than they are, and I'm going to ask you both, all of you, some questions. You have the bios of all of these incredible people in your folders, but I have to say a little bit about each one of them because I spent a lot of time learning about them and really impressive. Lauren is an English teacher at Chung International School, and she's probably one of the most thoughtful educators I've ever encountered. I watched and listened to some of your videos describing your interactions with your students and your parents, and you talk a lot about a love of learning and courage, which are issues I don't hear enough about in education. And we also have Dennis Civillo next to me, Sinyolo. He's the director of the Africa office of the Education International, and you come from a world where teachers are constantly impacted by violence. In some of your travels, some of the things you've seen that keep children out of school are truly frightening. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that. The Honorable Professor Adrian Piccoli. He is now with Korn Ferry, but he spent a lot of years dealing with people like me, annoying journalists, asking him a lot of questions and building up a lot of resilience just from that. Also, he took on some very controversial stands, and those are things that also build a lot of resilience. And from our previous conversation, so does teaching your children to drive. So I congratulate you on that. And finally, we have Angele Law. She's Director of Strategy and at programs at the Catalyst Education Lab. She traded in a career in business where she was traveling all around the world because of her concerns over teen suicides, student suicides in Hong Kong, and then she was studying at MIT where she saw another pattern of that repeat itself, and really came back to discover how important the quality of resilience is in her work going forward. So all of you bring in different experiences, and I'm going to ask you each, one at a time first, to describe an event or experience in your career that made you recognize and realize why resilience was such an important quality for the work that you do. I'm going to start with you, Dennis.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to be in this very important panel and this very important discussion on resilience. As already indicated, I'm Dennis Sinyolo from Education International, the global organization of teachers. I recall in the year 1990 when I was a young teacher from college in a rural school in Zimbabwe, and I was full of enthusiasm. And I had the zeal to work with my students and support them to succeed. The first day in class, we discussed the class rules and how we're going to work together and relate to each other with respect. And I encouraged my students and said, if you feel your rights are violated, let me know. Don't hold back. I'll do everything I can within my power to protect your rights as your teacher. It was as if I had invited trouble, actually. Guess what happened? A few days down the line, a girl comes back to school. It was after school, crying. And she says, "Teacher, you told me I should tell you if I have a problem. There are boys who are blocking me on my way home. They do the same in the morning when I'm going to school." These were boys from the community. They were making sexual advances. It was a case of sexual harassment. She happened to be an older girl in my class. So as a young enthusiastic teacher said, okay, I'll accompany you home. Remember, it's a rural Zimbabwean setup. Children walk maybe 10 kilometers to get home or to school. I'll accompany you home so that at least you're safe. Guess what happened? As I accompanied these children, the older girl and the younger ones, I became the victim myself. I was insulted, I was attacked by these young people from the community. It didn't end there. We were collecting water from one common source with the community. The boys ganged up and waited for me at the source, insulted me, threatened me. Every time I went to the business center, the shops, I would face the same thing. For 3 good years, I could have stopped teaching, right? I was just a young beginning teacher. I didn't. I continued. The bad news, which pains me until today, is that we lost that girl. She dropped out of school because of the pressure, the sexual harassment. But from that day, I made a decision that I have lost one girl, but I'll make sure I don't lose the rest of the children in my class. That I'll defend the rights of my children. I would not quit teaching. And I can tell you from that day, we have tried working together with teachers in Africa to come up with measures to prevent school-related gender-based violence. We have trained over 100,000 teachers as I speak right now. 5 weeks ago, we launched the 3rd phase of this program, which we call Educators Determined to End School-Related Gender-Based Violence.
That's incredible. Professor Piccoli.
So what my experience as a politician around resilience. So I think there's resilience to failure. How do you respond to failure? How do you respond to criticism? And how do you respond to trauma? The resilience you required. And I think in all those circumstances, it's a bit different. I mean, for me as a politician, as a public figure, why you need to be resilient is because you need to be confident in what you're doing in terms of reform or actions you might be doing around improving education systems. But then that public criticism is often designed to knock you off track, is to try to divert you into a different path, a path that you don't think is right, is not backed by the evidence or research or practice. So for me, it's not a specific event. It's a general event of being resilient to public criticism, to see your picture and your name on the front page of newspapers or on the radio, people saying all kinds of things about you and questioning your intellect and your values and virtues, but to have the resilience to be able to ignore that and continue to do what you think is the right thing and the advancement of the best interests of students. I think that's, for me, the resilience question at that, and I speak at that highest level. For me, that's the experience about the value of resilience.
And it's not always easy to do that.
No, it's not always easy. You know, the things that often are said publicly do hurt, and you've got to pretend they don't. But it then hurts your partner sees the things and hears the things that are being said about you and your mother and your father. You know, it's about that resilience, and I think this also relates to educators, as we'll talk about soon, about being confident in what you're doing, listening to the criticism, but continuing to do the things that you think are the right things to do.
Lauren, I thought it took resilience to have the kind of courage that you have to do the things that you're doing in your school and in your classroom. What is your story about when that sort of came to you?
So for me as an educator, I think one of my very key moments of when I really needed to be resilient came at a time where, of course, as many educators will relate, COVID and all the challenges that came with COVID. However, just before COVID hit us quite seriously, I had signed up to a research and development project with the Hong Kong Education Department. And I was feeling really passionate about this project, but it was still very much in the early phases. And I remember sitting in an online meeting with my supervisors. We were now dealing with the online-offline schooling situation, and they sat me down and said, many other teachers involved in this are going to put it on pause because there's just too much going on. There's too many other skills that teachers need to learn now. We don't have the time or space to focus on this work. And they asked me to make a decision if I also wanted to put the work on pause. At that point, I was still quite a new teacher in Hong Kong, so I was seen as very new to the system, new to my understanding of the demands of education in Hong Kong. And here I was trying to convince a whole bunch of teachers in my school to challenge the traditional systems, take on innovative practice on top of the demands of COVID. And it was in that moment where I had to ask myself, do I have the resilience to not only manage this myself individually, but to try and make an impact on a bigger system? And I decided to go forward with it because the work we were doing at that time gave a voice to the students when they really needed it, and it really paid off in the end.
That's great. And Angele, your story really fascinated me because you gave up a very good career in business because you had enormous concern for the students of the country in which you were raised. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your transition to that and the kind of resilience it took to leave one career to start another, but to care about the students that you're working with now and the difference that you can feel like you can make.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angele, and just want to start by thanking the Yidan team for inviting me as a panel of distinguished guests, and also the intention to add a local Hong Kong perspective to this dialogue. To give you a bit of context, I was born and raised in Hong Kong local education system all the way to university. But it was till, I would say, 24, when I had my quarter-life crisis, I would say. It was March 2016. I still remember that very month because I've been as a management consultant for 2 years, working with top CEOs on various issues and problems and strategies. But yet, I feel like life wasn't as personally meaningful. So I was asking this question of, what am I doing with my life? What do I truly want to create? And at that point of personal crisis was also a point of societal crisis, I would say, because March 2016 was a time where there was quite a surge in student suicide incidences in Hong Kong. So when I was reading the local news and seeing those incidences, I find myself really frustrated, angry, and also resonating a lot with this sentiment of feeling trapped. I think this sentiment is, it could be a lack of opportunity, a lack of resources, but also that feeling trapped by the expectation of the society of what success really means. And so that was kind of a turning point for me, where I really hope to see how I could be a part of growing that agency among all learners in the system, not just the students, but also the educators, feeling that they too have the choice and with collective power could help support the education space and innovate. And so now I am working with principals and teachers, really acting as a companion to hope that we could connect, inspire, and ignite innovation in the Hong Kong education space, so that the education system could be a place of compassion for everyone involved.
That's so interesting. And, you know, as we heard earlier, education has really been challenged over the years, the global pandemic, learning loss, all of war in many countries, upheavals. What you're doing now, talking about it is one thing, but when you're in the classroom and trying to motivate others, I know in the US, 1 in 5 leave. You know, there's so much teacher turnover, and I feel like all of you have talked about that as well. So what does it take to motivate the educators you work with, to have them develop some of the resilience that you've had? What do you do for that? How does that work for you, Dennis?
Yes, first of all, just to restate that conflict is a serious problem, particularly in Africa, but also in many parts of the world. Think about countries like Nigeria or the Sahel region, where actually many schools are not functioning or teachers are under attack, students are under attack. That includes kidnappings, by the way. You're in a school, and then armed men walk into a school and they kidnap the whole school. Exactly, for ransom. So our members, the teachers, are working under very difficult circumstances. And quite often the salaries are not paid on time, and they are not paid regularly. Without naming countries, in one country, teachers haven't been paid for 8 years. Not months, years. You heard me right. Teachers haven't been paid. In another, teachers haven't been paid for 1 year. In another country, a big country in Africa, you can ask me during lunch hour which countries those are. Teachers in half of the states, 36 states in that country, in 18 of them are not paid regularly. Quite often they wait for 8 months without a salary. And on average, we're talking about 100 USD or less per month. That's the salary of a teacher, on average, in most of these countries. That's not enough, obviously, for the teacher to be able to meet their basic needs. You're asking, how do you motivate them in
How
those
do you keep them there?
circumstances?
How do you even keep them there?
Exactly. How do you keep them there? So first of all, it's important to improve the salaries and working conditions of teachers, because that's the most important way of keeping them there. But also you must trust them, you must value them, you must give them the autonomy they need to focus on their work. Improving the teaching and learning conditions is important, giving them the tools. Whether we're talking about the appropriate use of technology, I'm using the word appropriate, that's very important, because it can as well have challenges, yes. Or whether you're talking about textbooks, class size, and so forth and so on. So it's a package of all these things combined together. But the most important of them all actually is improving the working conditions, providing the training, the professional support that teachers need, including teacher learning communities, so that they can learn from each other, support each other, motivate each other, including through technology.
It's great. We're going to come back to the learning communities later. In your situation, when you take a controversial stand on inequality, which was a big part of your work, how do you square that when there are people who just dislike and disagree with your ideas for what will improve education?
Yeah, and a lot of that is around is that public advocacy about explaining why you're doing what you're doing, and sometimes that was explaining the economics of education, that it's good for a society or for a state or a country from an economic perspective to improve the performance, the education performance of that equity group or the disadvantaged.
For all students.
For all students. So it's as much the investment in education is as much is like an investment in new roads or infrastructure or port facilities. I mean, all of those things stimulate the economy, but the strongest economies have the best educated individuals, both at the highest level and at the most basic level. So literacy, numeracy, skills. I mean, they are investments in the economy. And listening to Naomi this morning, you know, it's as much about talking to finance ministers and prime ministers, presidents about the benefits, because they're all about the economy. Governments, political parties always want to talk about the economy, and rightly, and linking the improvement in education to the economy and the improvement in the economy is an important way of getting reforms and funding and some of the other societal changes you need in order to get those improvements in education. So sometimes educators, we have a tendency to talk to ourselves, but it's important to make that case out there. And you know that there's that constant advocacy, and there will be criticism, because if you want to spend $5 billion on education, it's $5 billion you're not spending on some new tunnel or a new train line, and you've got to make that societal argument, but also that economic argument that it's actually a good investment of public funds.
And it strikes me in learning more about you, Lauren, that you spoke a lot about courage, which seems to me a theme very much inherent in any conversation about resilience. How does that work for some of the educators you work with who are under enormous pressure around exams, around student performance? What does it look like to create resilience in those communities?
Well, I think in Hong Kong especially, to speak from that perspective, the demands on teachers And of course, on the students, it's incredible. I couldn't quite fathom it in my first year or so here. I came from South Africa. I was a teacher in South Africa before coming to Hong Kong. And it was mind-blowing, the expectations on students and teachers. And I think a huge challenge to developing resilience as an educator is that feeling of being overwhelmed by the system, not having a place in the system. So we hear conversations about funding for education, decisions made by the powers above us, by systems that we don't feel perhaps directly able to influence. And I think many teachers can get lost in that feeling of there is nothing I can do about it. And I think for teachers to learn how to develop resilience, they need to feel some kind of place within the larger systems and develop an understanding of the larger systems that they work in, whether it might just be an individual school leadership system or the greater educational reforms within the country that they work in. But for many teachers, I think, as has been said before, giving a sense of agency and empowering them to make the change that they can within their context helps them to develop that sense of resilience. It's a
Somebody
mindset.
must have done that for you.
Yes, yes, definitely. I think when you tap into a teacher's passion and purpose, when they feel seen and heard in their space, when you give them that space to have agency and you empower them, that really helps them to develop the mindset of resilience. That in combination with learning communities and having voices around you echoing similar passions, similar drive.
Yeah, if
Angele.
I might jump in, because Lauren is in fact a part of our community, and I think that silo breaking is really important. The feel of I'm a lone teacher trying to innovate in my own context, if we could break that view. We started off as a nonprofit feeling that we are doing capacity building, bringing in Harvard or MIT new innovation ideas to the educators, but we soon realized our work is a lot more on the community building piece that was alluded to. The feeling that we could come together as a community across disciplines in a specific school and also across schools. To feel like we could connect, share our struggles, inspire each other, and feel like we as a group could advocate for aspects that go beyond one single school. Say, for example, we have education leaders where we call shapers who are in the room today, advocating for neurodiversity instead of just deficit mindset of special education needs. Advocating for, could we reform the student report card, which is not a single endeavor that a school can do. And so having those community come together as educators to share vulnerabilities and innovation and action, and having that collective action is very important.
Do you have that kind of an opportunity in many of the communities you work with to get the teachers working together and sharing some of their experiences and their concerns, which many of them are safety concerns?
Yes, we do. I'll just share a few examples. For example, a couple of years ago in Mali at the time still is facing conflict. So we chose some regions in Mali and targeted what we call community teachers. These are teachers who are actually hired by parents because the government has not been able to hire those teachers in community schools established by parents, usually temporary structures. So we said, what do we do to support these teachers and, of course, by extension, children? So we designed a program, a 3-year program, to upgrade the skills of these teachers through a program we call the Quality Educators for All program. It became a very successful program, actually. After 3 years, these teachers in community schools went on to write a national examination, which is a requirement for anybody to qualify to teach in Mali, and passed. As I speak, over 3,000 of them passed the exam, and the government was so impressed. The teachers' union in Mali, working with us, the global mother body of these unions, advocated for these teachers to be integrated into the public service. So the government took them over as government workers after they had passed. So their conditions of service improved. Not just that, the government went on to take over the community schools. That helped to improve infrastructure in Mali. That's one example. So these teachers, during their training, were working together with a face-to-face component and a component through technology. Of course, the internet is a problem in many African countries, especially in rural areas. So we had to use very innovative approaches. For example, the training materials were put on SD cards, which were given to the teachers to use on their smartphones to access the training materials. Face-to-face plus continuous support. The second example is from Uganda and South Sudan. Again, these are conflict contexts. And then in this context, in the case of Uganda, we targeted teachers in 2 refugee camps, including refugee teachers, actually. Because quite often it's a problem for refugee teachers to be allowed to teach in the host country. So part of the program was to build their capacity to train them, but also, remember I talked earlier about protecting children, right? For example, against school-related gender-based violence. So we worked together with the union there in Uganda to come up with a professional code of conduct for teachers teaching children in refugee settings. So that was very important in protecting both the teachers and the students. But finally, I have a lovely story of a lady called Stella. We identified this lady at a refugee camp in Uganda. She's a teacher there. So during this program, we realized she had so much potential. When there was a UN meeting in Geneva, we invited Stella. Those who were there probably remember her. Yes, together with other young people. I heard a young person saying, give us a chance. That's exactly what we did. I gave up my speaking role at the UN meeting, personally, and handed it over to Stella. But you have to support them. You have to prepare. So we did a lot of preparation. Stella delivered in that very important meeting in Geneva. So it's a success story of a refugee teacher from South Sudan working in Uganda, who is now as Education International, our ambassador on these international platforms.
That's amazing, and I think that we all love success stories. Because a lot of what we've been discussing when we talk about the global problems facing education are really bleak. I would like to take you back into the classroom for a second, Professor, and think about the time that you spent improving the teachers where you were. What did you do to help them develop resilience, even as a politician? How did you make sure they were on a trajectory of improving at all times?
Yeah. So on multiple levels. So I think as an education minister, how did I view this, right? I think like in education, there's never a single thing. So it's supporting teachers at a classroom level, resources, time is the one thing teachers always want more of is time. So creating some of that space to do some of that innovation thinking, collaboration amongst their peers. But I also took the perspective from a very high level around as one of the national education leaders is about advancing the perception of teachers, the status of the teaching profession. So just doesn't matter what happened. If I was fighting with teachers' unions, it was always speaking very publicly and positively about the teaching profession, about the value of it, the contribution. Because I think that's a really important thing in the national psyche. Because the media, a lot of media, public commentary around education is often negative. And we see that now with international testing. PISA results come out and it's the teachers and it's the school system.
Bad scores, bad news.
And I think that really undermines the teachers individually and the profession. Yet 30% of a student's performance is based upon their 30% of a child's performance in school is determined by what happens in the classroom, 70% of it everywhere else. But whenever we talk about the performance of students, it always comes back, the public commentary always comes back to teachers. So I was trying to make that not about...
That's right.
Not just about teachers. Yes, you're constantly improving, but there's never that further question about, okay, what's happening in society? I mean, why is it that sort of internationally even now, most jurisdictions are declining? I mean, surely better, there's more money, better trained and supported teachers than ever, yet the performance is going down. So there's got to be this sort of broader conversation about what's happening in education. And I think that whole thing about not undermining the teaching profession by constantly looking for all the solutions within the classroom.
Do you want to give it a stab?
Well, I'm in the business of looking within the classroom, so I think from my perspective, to echo what we've heard in our earlier panels, if we want to start finding solutions that maybe aren't always about addressing what happens with academics within a classroom, we need to hear more of our students' voices. How are these outside factors impacting them? What helps to shape their learning, their moral development, their character development? And I feel that perhaps we need to have more conversations, as we've said earlier, with the students and bring the students' voice into shaping our classrooms and shaping education.
Angele?
When I was hearing the conversation, I suddenly recalled an incident with the vice principal. The vice principal told me that she tends to be the last person leaving the staff room to turn off the lights. It's usually 8:30 p.m. And then one day she decided that she would leave 6:30. And then when she packed her bags and started leaving the staff room, everyone gave her a round of applause. I think this incident sort of indicates a lot. One, around how in Hong Kong, and I dare say Asian culture of celebrating busyness and feeling that if you're not busy, you're not doing things right. And so here in Hong Kong, half of the teachers are having 60-hour work weeks.
That's a very long week.
Yes. And I think that how we could sort of shift the mental model of, hey, it's not busyness that we are striving for, but prioritizing deeper reflections as to how do we really grow the emotional literacy of both the adults in the system, speaking about their exhaustion and how they feel about things, how they could think about the issues instead of the quick fixes of how things keep going on again, but dig through the root causes, and really have those aspirational conversations instead of how do we get rid of this problem, what is it that we actually have to create. I think cultivating those spaces and awareness for these deeper dialogues, prioritizing reflection, which we always ask our students to do, is very important in growing that resilience among the teacher group.
It's so interesting because you all come from such complete different situations and backgrounds. But since you have this audience today of policymakers and teachers and people from all over the world, we're going to ask you quickly to give your own sense of advice. This is an audience question, not mine, because I could be here for 3 or 4 more hours talking to each of you. But they would like to know what your advice is for improving the abilities of teachers, their training, and their ability to gain confidence and resilience. What would you do?
Yes, we need to have a teacher policy. And that policy should be developed with the full involvement of the teachers. Nothing for us without us is a fundamental principle. So we need to be ambitious. We have heard about issues of workload, work-life balance. These are critical issues which can be included in that kind of policy. Of course, you need a policy, you need legislation, and then you need financing. I would put it this way. I have talked about this before, those who have heard me speak, about the 5 bigs, the word big, B-I-G, the 5 bigs. Now, the principle of the 5 bigs goes this way. It's a principle you can use when you are reforming your education system or coming up with a teacher policy, for example, as in this case. The first big is think big. Think big. That's fundamental. Don't limit yourself. Quite often, we have self-censorship in coming up with programs or reforms to support our teachers. We shouldn't limit ourselves. Think big. And then the second big is actually plan big. You need to plan. You think, you plan, a vision must be planned. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And then the third big is invest big. Put money into it. Otherwise, nothing will happen. The fourth big is act big. Implement that program, or else nothing will happen. The sad news is that many African countries have good policies, for example, not just in Africa and elsewhere, which are not implemented. And the fifth big is achieve big. Just to repeat, think big, don't limit yourself, right? Think big, plan big, invest big, act big, and achieve big. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a tough one to follow.
So I would say, look, and I can't help but think from my own experience or my own trauma from being a politician, but, set standards, and there is there's still room for agency within the standards you set for a profession, whether it's teaching or medicine or whatever it is. You set standards, you guard those standards by making sure that there are disciplinary avenues for people who might operate outside those standards, because I think it's one thing to set them, it's another to guard them. And then training is very important, and I think this applies to any profession. And the fourth one is leadership. So teachers don't want to be professionally isolated, or when their judgment decisions are challenged by parents or by somebody else, they want the leadership within the school to back their professionalism. Or schools, if somebody's criticising a school, they want the system to back the principal's professionalism. And again, I think this is where the most effective professions work really well, when those four things are in place and in place well. I don't know why it is in teaching, but the number of people who challenge the professional judgment of teachers, who would never challenge the professional judgment of, well, not never, but rarely judge the professional judgment of a doctor or a nurse. Questioned, it's constantly undermined, and I think the more that we can do to back the professionalism of teachers and increase the status of that profession so that people don't challenge it, I think that's when you will support, that's the things we can do that best support the resilience of the teaching profession.
Trust them, it sounds like. Trust in teachers is kind of what you're saying.
I think I'm quite fortunate that my experiences in Hong Kong, I have felt incredibly trusted and respected as an educator. So I think we're quite lucky this side of the world with that. For me, though, definitely what teachers need this side, and to continue to speak to this message of resilience, is that time and space dedicated to creating learning communities. I mean, giving teachers the space to have that dialogue and to have the conversations that continue to build their resilience. I think very often, yes, there's incredible demands on teachers here, and yes, the expectation from different stakeholders is enormous, but I feel that many teachers are there and they're willing to do the work and they're driven to do the work, and sometimes their resilience falters when they feel alone and overwhelmed. And I feel that if we can continue to create time and space for learning communities for teachers, that will further develop their abilities to be resilient in the face of all changes in the future.
Given that the panel has talked about thinking big, I'll suggest something to start really small. So I'd been advocating in all our convenings with teachers and principal groups to start with a check-in. And a check-in is a foundational practice for a framework called compassionate systems. And the check-in involves 3 steps. Grounding, so a simple meditation to allow you to get a sense of how you're feeling. Second, journaling, to actually sort of write down how you're feeling at this moment, what your aspiration for this convening is. and then a small group check-in, i.e. having everyone around the table actually having the voice to share how they are feeling at this moment, how they are showing up in the space. And this grounding journal check-in in itself already built up a very different community where people feel like they could work together in advancing whatever the goal is. And so this connection before content is what I feel very beneficial and proven to be very successful across different spaces in Asia and in Hong Kong as well.
Okay, thank you. I love this next question. And it's really important one, too, because it touches on a lot of the themes that you've all talked about. How can teachers globally and in Hong Kong challenge the images of their success in work as it is now measured merely in students' academic success and, as you pointed out, often questioned? Who would like to tackle that? I know it's a little bit different from the kinds of experiences that you spoke about for your teachers, but there's still questions of how their success is measured.
Yes, I can start. You're right. The problem with our education systems in most parts of the world is that they're examination-oriented. I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be any examinations, but the consequence of focusing too much on testing is that you force schools and teachers to teach to the test, instead of focusing on the full development of the child or young person, including, obviously, the foundational skills, the higher order skills, creativity, innovation, adaptability, and so forth and so on. You limit that to preparing for examinations. This is where the problem is. Remember that there is conflict in the world today, and you cannot solve issues of conflict by simply preparing children to pass tests. You need to also focus on ethics and values, living together, respect, intercultural understanding. So we need to go back to the basics. UNESCO some years back came up with a very good report. I'm seeing Mr. Chung here. He was leading that work. That report is very important because it looks at the different dimensions of learning. Learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. We need to go back to those basics. But how do we do it? Of course, it means we need to have an open dialogue about the future of education globally, regionally, and at national level. We need to go back to the basics, or else we are losing it. We're narrowing our education systems, and that may jeopardize the future of our children and the future of humanity.
The issue of standardised testing, national testing or international testing, has never been driven by educators. It's been driven by governments and by politics, by the transactional nature of politics. We invest X billions of dollars in education, we expect him, and then next year we do X billion plus Y, we expect the results to go up. So it's driven by politics, and I think very much at the expense of children, very much at the expense of the complexity and diversity of education that as a young person you need. Now the measure of the success of a 15-year-old in a country is a PISA test or a TIMSS test. Doesn't take into consideration the issues in Africa, just getting students into a classroom, just getting teachers. Keeping
them safe, yeah.
All of those, all the different cultural expectations in Hong Kong, Japan or Australia. It has just really narrowed the perspective of education down to this sort of one test, and then your success or failure as a country in education is determined by that outcome. And then every year when those results come out, that starts to influence government decision making in adverse ways.
And since we're short on time, the Hong Kong folks right here, let's hear about your perspective, because part of that question involved what happens right here.
Yes, and I think this is probably something that Angele can speak really passionately about when we look at our report cards in Hong Kong. Definitely this issue of standardized testing and what it represents in terms of the success or failure of a student is a really huge issue, and I think it sends a really strong message to our students about how we measure success. But I think I shall leave since we're running out of time. I think Angele has some great things to say on this.
I was actually thinking of that analogy of if you tell a baby, don't touch the fire, they would be compelled to do it. So it's this importance of not just saying no to an exam-oriented culture, but being really articulate on what exactly are we trying to celebrate. And I think in global metrics, measuring resilience is an effort that we are now going on. And also in the local systems, considering how, in addition to these usual metrics, we are drawing attention and celebrating these progresses that students are made in their learning, those social emotional skills. I think it's more about where we draw our attention to instead of just saying no to something that we want to get rid of that would help change the environment.
Thank you. Do I have some time for more questions? I'm not sure if I do, because I have a lot of them. Great. People say there's no such thing as a bad teacher. Do you believe that's the case? We've been sticking up for teachers a lot during this whole during this conversation, and how can an opinion like that help improve the teaching force? Is there any such thing as a bad teacher? Dennis?
Bad teacher?
Yeah.
Oh, well. That's what kills the profession, right? Labeling teachers good or bad. There's nothing like that. Quite often it's a bad system. Not really the teacher, because teachers need support around them, training, professional development. If it's lacking, obviously they will not be able to deliver, to do what they know how to do best, which is to teach. But of course, let's face it, for you to be a teacher, you must be trained. Sometimes people without training are just taken and put in front of children, and they're given the label teacher. They're not really teachers. So people must be trained. They must be grounded, both in teaching content and methodology, but also the ethics of teaching. How you relate to your students, how you relate to parents, how you relate to your colleagues is very important. That's why professional ethics are very important. But if we don't provide all this training and capacity building, teachers won't know. We cannot just assume that they will just get up and know without training, without support. So that is very, very important. So in short, there's no bad teacher. There's a bad system that fails to support the teacher.
Sorry, Dennis, I'm going to disagree with you here. There are bad teachers. They're not bad people. They're in the wrong profession.
They're just bad teachers.
Or they've been good teachers, and for whatever reason, they've spent 20, 30, 10 years and are worn out, maybe burnt out, but they remain there because they feel compelled to stay in there for lots of personal and financial reasons, but they shouldn't be there. I mean, this is what I said about you can set the standards, but you've got to guard them. And guarding them means removing teachers who should no longer be in the profession. Because this idea that there aren't bad teachers, I mean, nobody in the staff room wants to sit next to somebody who's a bad teacher, because otherwise the other teachers are carrying the load. So I think this notion that there aren't bad teachers is bad for the profession. Teachers who start teacher training don't get asked the question, do you like children? Now, before you start your degree, you should be asked that question, because if you don't like children, it's the wrong profession for you. So I think even fundamental things like that, and every teacher I've spoken to said in the classroom, in their staff room, there would be teachers there that they think don't like the company of children. In that case, it is time to do something else.
I was asking if I can come back. Yes, actually, it's very important that he disagrees because it gives me an opportunity to explain. Right? It's an orientation, a perspective on how you approach education and teachers. If you start from the point that teachers are bad, guess what? You'll go into a school with that assumption. You will have inspectorate mechanisms that are meant to punish teachers. So the reason I'm saying teachers are not really bad is when you walk into a school, you are not going there to get rid of bad teachers. You are going there to identify the challenges they face and support them. That's what will improve our education systems, not punishment.
So maybe the question isn't, are there bad teachers, but how do we make them better? But first, you can answer the original questions, Lauren.
I think I have to echo what Dennis is saying. I don't think there's bad teachers. I think there are bad systems of support. There is a teacher, if it is a case a teacher has faced burnout, where was the support preventing that burnout? Where is the support for teachers' mental and emotional well-being? Where is the professional development support, etc.? I think anyone who usually enters into the profession and survives beyond 2 or 3 years, then yes, it potentially is a profession for them. Many people perhaps are not right for working with children or the demands of children and parents. But if you've survived that long, then it means that there needs to be greater support for those teachers. If they're struggling, if they don't have the training, if they don't understand the ethics behind it, there can be support to make that teacher a better teacher. It's not a bad teacher, sometimes it's a bad situation.
Completely resonate this view of actually how do we create a better environment for the teachers to thrive. But if I have one threshold for bad teachers, I would say a bad teacher is one that doesn't see themselves as a student. A bad teacher is someone that doesn't see themselves as a student, because that willingness to continue learning both from their students, their peers, and actually continuing the innovation and improvement. I think that mindset is what I would categorize as bad.
You want to always be learning, always be thinking, and always improving your work and your profession.
If I'm the lone wolf here, right, so I get the second comeback, right? There are very powerful institutional players here that prevent performance management and other things. You know, unions, teacher unions, very powerful in most countries. But even universities, they don't want usually standards to get into university. They want to scoop in as many students as possible. They're great revenue earner for universities. You know, there's just not this. I just don't think there's the hard enough standards in place. Because if you think what's in the best interest of students, then you can't have that person sitting in a staff room who should have left the profession 5 years ago. And unions often back them, and that's what makes that performance
very hard to get rid of
very
them.
politically difficult.
That seems to be universal. Do you want to have a comeback?
Yes. Well, I represent
we even dressed the
unions,
same
right?
today because...
Now, just to say, the problem is you develop those policies without involving the teachers through their unions. So when you come up with professional ethics and standards, make sure that the teachers are at the driving seat, because they will not own something which was developed by somebody else and imposed on them. So that involvement, that voice, that dialogue with teacher unions is fundamental. The last point on whether there is a bad teacher or not, I would ask the same question: is there anything like a bad student? It's a fundamental question. I can tell you, when I was a teacher, whenever I received a new class, the teachers who handled those classes would tell me about each individual student and how bad or good they were. I listened out of respect and threw the advice out of the window. Why? Because I wanted to give every child an opportunity and a fresh start. I can tell you, one of the so-called bad students has a PhD today. They went on to succeed because I gave them a chance. I didn't look at them as bad people. I looked at them as people who had potential and needed support to flourish. So it should be the same thing with our teachers.
I would have loved to be in your classroom when you were a teacher. Anyone else want to tackle that one? Would you like to respond to Dennis, anyone? Any disagreement? We know that you disagree.
I would. I think the students and teachers are different things. I mean, it's a different power dynamic. It's a different, you know, one is providing a service is maybe not the right way to say it, a function to another. It's like saying there are bad nurses, but are there bad patients? Like I don't think so. You get who you get when you're a nurse as a patient or as a student. I just think we let the profession down when we actually don't protect and guard the standards that you need to meet to be a teacher. And when people don't meet those standards, then they need to be either need to be retrained. I get that, right?
Yep.
Retrained, supported, not left there because this problem that we often protect the interests of adults in education ahead of the interests of students. So it's difficult to performance manage that teacher, that 45-year-old teacher, so we let them stay, but we don't think about what's in the best... when I say we, systems, politicians, others, don't support, are putting the interests of that adult ahead of the student, because adults complain, students tend not to. So at a political and system level, they're often, enforcing some of those rules is let go.
It's difficult, yeah. We have time for one more question, and it seems to make a lot of sense because you all come from coming at this from very different experiences, and some of the issues that you have been talking about are universal. One thing that has been universal is the pandemic. And schools shutting down. In the United States, a lot of teachers left afterwards. We're struggling with a lot of learning loss. If that didn't build resilience in teachers, it may have had them leave, led to their departures. Each one of you could talk a little bit about the resilience that is required and that you've learned from there, because with the test scores dropping and schools closing, more than ever, education has been under enormous pressure. What's come out of it that's, in a way, a common lesson for us all?
Yeah, actually, the pandemic had very devastating effects on education. In Africa, we lost more than 2,000 teachers, by the way, to COVID-19, more than 2,000 in Africa. We did a study. And girls were disproportionately affected due to early pregnancy or child marriage, all those kinds of challenges. Child labor also increased during the pandemic. And then it also exposed existing problems in Africa. For example, the digital divide is very huge. No computers, no internet facilities, no electricity in the rural areas in particular. So there was no learning taking place.
No learning online.
No,
Period.
not learning online. I mean, teachers had to be creative. They had to come up with learning packages, which were then given to families for children to go and learn at home. So what we have learned from that is that actually we need to close the digital divide. We can leverage technology to support teaching and learning without, of course, replacing the teacher. That's fundamental. I've always said we need to move from the traditional chalk and talk to the modern touch and teach. We also need to move from the chalkboard to the smartboard, but with responsibility and ethics.
You have to have the smart boards to begin with, right? Which is a real problem.
I think one of the interesting perspectives to come out of COVID was, I think because parents, certainly in Australia, I can only speak of my experience in Australia, the students were learning from home, and parents realised how difficult it is to be a teacher and how difficult it is to teach your children, because it's easier to send them off to school every day, but when they were home and you were, trying to teach them maths, or you were trying to help them with Zoom or Teams, whatever they were using, I think there wasn't a greater appreciation actually of what teachers do every day. And my child is not an angel when I send them off to school. And I think that was, in Australia, one of the perspectives that came out of it was actually a bit more respect for teachers and what they do.
I think for me, the greatest thing to come out of it, it might have been short-lived, but there are some remnants of this. The move away from the pressure of testing, examinations, standardized testing, and the focus on the student experience, the relationship between teacher and student, the fact that because we were learning on Zoom and because some students couldn't even get onto Zoom, how are we still shaping their learning, and what was really important in those few sessions that you could have with them in the limited time that you had online. And I think we completely relooked at what goes on in a classroom and what we define learning to be. And I think a lot of the outcomes from that is, as we've said here, the fact that teachers' roles are really important. It's not just a case of preparing for a standardized test, but it's those relationships and the time that teachers take to make learning impactful, meaningful, and form relationships with their students.
For me, it's the importance of social and emotional learning. I was, during COVID, leading some Zoom sessions with both teachers and students, naming their emotions in times of crises. So in the wheel of emotions, are you feeling angry? Are you feeling fear? The ability to name those emotions both as adults and as students, not just in COVID times, but in any adverse situation. I think that emphasis is something I think coming out of COVID, a great opportunity to tap into.
Well, it seems like a good way to sort of wrap up this panel because we're thinking about the future and what we've learned and what can make things better. So I'm hoping that we can give a great round of applause to this fabulous panel.